Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talking TWAMPs. My name is Blake, and I'll be your host for today. An episode where we will...
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry, you can't put that many O's in that word. They don't fit.
I will put 50,000 O's in that word.
For the record, I'm going to splice together all of the stuff we've had from before this, so that it's just like a thing of Ryan and then transitions directly into that.
Today we will be discussing Brexit.
You don't want to do a new intro?
Losers!
Goodbye, everybody, and welcome to Talking TWAMPs. My name is Blake Phillips, and I will be hosting this episode where today we will be discussing Brexit.
That spiked the audio on my microphone.
But before we get into that, let's have a quick intro. As I mentioned, my name is Blake Phillips, and I am a government and German major here at the college.
My name is Jakob, and I am our oft-beleaguered editor sometimes. And I want to talk about Brexit.
I'm William Moore, a government and economics student. I was really half tempted to do my intro in French just so that I could be, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm interested in Brexit, and it was a hot topic when I spent my semester abroad last semester. It was literally all we talked about in my EU politics and institutions class. I swear to God.
And I am Joe. I am an IR and Russian studies student. I wanted to talk about board games, but this is cool too.
You literally never mentioned that.
I literally
did mention it. I
You
may
guys
or
just
may
weren't
not have
listening.
shouted Joe down.
You guys just weren't listening. Nobody listens to me, so it's okay.
Well, you record everything we say, so it's all right. All right, so let's get into it. As we do with most episodes, can one of you provide just sort of a brief intro of not only what Brexit is, I think we've already done a Brexit episode, but where it is now, where it stands, where our deadlines are?
Well, if I can be a little expressive here, Brexit has become a dumpster fire that is spreading out of control and just making the whole of the British Isles into one enormous combination garbage heap and human disaster.
Dumpster is actually copyrighted, so you can't say that on there.
Can I not?
Dumpster is like Xerox machine or Post-it note. It's
But
copyrighted.
Xerox has been so overused that you actually can't.
Oh,
I
really?
think no dumpster. It is.
Okay,
There's
anyway.
the principle of generalization, where if a
is
word
that true?
is used
Yeah,
so often,
I'm pretty sure dumpster's
yeah.
passed into free use, but
It's
let's
like
get off
okay.
the etymology of free
Okay,
use.
anyway.
Anyway.
So the
Into
important
the more
event,
specifics.
though, the specific important event that has just happened is obviously there was the referendum a couple of years ago where Great Britain decided it was going to leave. What's important is that just recently, as of last week, Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit plan, the specific outline of what Brexit would look like, failed in the House of Commons due to defections not only from her own party, but also the party of the ruling coalition that is providing confidence and supply to the Conservatives, the Dublin Unionist Party.
And we should note, it didn't just fail. It failed incredibly spectacularly. It was the most voted against any bill in the British House of Commons since the Great Depression. So this is a spectacular failure for this deal.
I mean, no great shocker in American politics. It would have looked like any normal procedural fail of any bill, but in Britain it was quite spectacular.
Great Britain is almost an oligarchy. They don't tend to disagree with each other.
So that's where Brexit currently stands.
Well, there's one more thing that
Oh, sorry.
you didn't
Go ahead
mention,
then.
which
Yeah.
is that after the bill failed, typically when there's a spectacular failure of this sort, there is a vote of no confidence, and there was a vote of no confidence this time. However, Prime Minister May did survive that vote of no confidence, basically because nobody wants her job, and so she will continue, I guess, to try to make a new deal.
And it's very interesting that Joe brings that up because this is important. And we all remember, of course, but maybe our listeners don't, that Theresa May called an election about a year ago, a snap election, in which her party lost an enormous number of seats due to declining popularity. They actually lost their majority in the House of Commons and have had to rule in a coalition with the Dublin Unionist Party. And what's important about that...
All 10 of them.
Yeah.
It's enough.
It's enough. And what's interesting is that Theresa May's Conservatives have only become less popular since then. So the big question on everybody's mind is, do the Conservatives still have a mandate to rule, to govern? And if they don't, what does that mean for the government of Great Britain, which is essentially rudderless after the failure of this Brexit plan?
So that's a good segue into the next question. So that's where we are with Brexit. The next question is where we're going with Brexit. Just a couple of quick factual things, if somebody could clue us in. When does Brexit technically have to get finished?
I believe the 29th or the 19th of March. It's
So-
some 9 number in March.
I believe it is the 19th of March, but I could be wrong. And essentially that means we're running up on the 3-month mark.
29th of March, 2019.
Oh, I was wrong. The 29th of March. So it is, we're running up on, it would be actually the 2-month mark to get this finalized. And very, very little progress has been made.
And what's key here is that this isn't just the deadline by which Theresa May and her government have to present a bill and pass it before the House of Commons. That's the deadline by which the European Union has to agree to a plan. And they had previously agreed to the plan that went before Parliament this time around, which did not pass. So the question that's remaining now is, A, what incentive does the EU have to renegotiate a Brexit plan? Joe is making a zero at me, and I tend to agree with him on this point. And if they don't do that, what can Theresa May do to make sure this is not a total...
So if memory serves, we have already had an episode on the intricacies of Brexit, the issues that might have been sticking points. But now with the failure of this bill, we have a slightly clearer idea of which of those sticking points have manifested. So if we might, I'd like to run down sort of where we're stuck and what the solutions might be to those particular stickings, and whether or not we think they can be unstuck in the next 2 months. I'd like to start with Ireland.
That I was going to say.
Yeah,
that's
Blake,
the
why
big
don't
one.
you tell us
The
about
Irish
Ireland?
backstop there.
So as our listeners may or may not know, I have a particular affinity for the Irish people and their current state of oppression in Northern Ireland. But even if I were not to take such an extreme stance, there is a bit of a sticky issue. Northern Ireland is part of the UK, which is...
Of UK.
Yeah, it's part of the UK, and as a result, has no economic border between themselves and the UK. And up until this point, it's not been much of an issue, because as the UK and Ireland were both members of the EU, there was already no economic border between those two countries, and as a result, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was functionally non-existent.
And that was really key in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement,
Which I was about to get to.
to ameliorate that conflict.
So in the late 90s, there was an end to the conflict between between the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, neither of which either of those countries was really openly fighting, but did have a great deal of bloodshed involved. And it ended as a result of an agreement that said that there could be no trade barrier between the Northern Irish part of the UK and Ireland. Again, not much of an issue because the EU already had no trade barriers internally. Now that Brexit is occurring, the current deal has what has been called a Northern Irish backstop. There would still be no trade barrier between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but there would be a customs trade barrier between Northern Ireland and the UK, effectively economically splitting the two nations. The DUP, which is an Irish-based party in the UK government and is propping up May's government, is not particularly happy with the idea of there being a customs border in the middle of a country.
And for good reason. I mean, they are the unionist party.
And to be fair, it's not only the DUP that's mad about this, just about everybody else. But the question that I will put to this group is, what's the other option?
Well, one of the important and radical ones that I think we've kind of been dancing around is called Referendum 2.0. The idea being that the referendum to exit the European Union passed by 0.5%.
AKA the
first time
people's
around.
vote, yeah? That's what they're calling it.
And the idea is, now that they've seen the realities of Brexit, maybe a lot of people have gotten, I mean, almost certainly, right? A lot of people have probably gotten cold feet about the whole thing. And that, I think, right now is the stance of a lot of Labour MPs, but not Jeremy Corbyn, Labour leader, who is, believe it or not, pro-Brexit. So those are the options, I think, more or less. And of course, there's
Well,
the
that's
option
the
of a
option
hard,
specifically for that. I mean, there's several different options with what the UK can do now. The issue is the fact that there's only 2 months left. That is not a sufficient amount of time to renegotiate a deal. It just
Not wholly, which is why
yes.
is why I'm suggesting that we tackle this. I think I will make it clear to the listeners. There's almost no way that we could renegotiate a whole deal. There are a couple of other broader options that I'd like to discuss later. One of which is a second referendum that could possibly end Brexit. But another is that the EU could vote to extend the timeline, which is another option. But within this issue itself, do you all have anything else meaningful to contribute to the idea of would the EU and could the EUK propose a different solution to the Irish border issue, which is one of the key linchpins to why it failed?
So sure, they could provide another solution to the Irish border issue. I mean, there are all sorts of... You could set up a customs union that would only include Ireland, and Ireland could have special customs requirements with the UK. You could just separate Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland, and they would have to eat that, right? That's not going to be popular either. You could have an independence referendum in Northern Ireland. That looks like it would still probably fail, but it's another option. What it comes down to, though, is if they solve this problem of the Irish backstop, there is no guarantee that that would be enough to get this Brexit deal passed. Because a lot of people hate this deal for a lot of reasons. The Irish backstop is just the most public
right,
of
which
the
is why I was
issues.
going to get to the next issue that I would like to discuss a little bit. So obviously the Irish backstop is not the only reason that this deal failed. Another one is immigration. One of the key things that people voted on Brexit-wise, was the idea that the UK would be able to control migration in and out of the UK. The current deal as it stands has very strict migration controls, essentially no EU agreement with respect to migration, but not a lot of conservative MPs are big on that. Do we see any potential solutions out of the UK or EU on immigration in this deal?
I would say that the big issue that we're seeing in the United Kingdom is a difference between what the MPs want and what seemed to be implied by the referendum. If it really is so much about immigration, many conservative MPs actually aren't particularly against immigration, especially from EU member states, because it brings in a relatively cheap labor force. Now, that being said, they usually have to go with what their constituencies want, and some of the UKIP more aligned MPs definitely are for stopping immigration. The problem is that the biggest issue that I see is the reciprocity that it has with the EU about Britons abroad. There are plenty of EU people who live in Britain and plenty of UK citizens who live in the European Union. How do you deal with that? Probably the best answer, it seems to be at the moment, and I'm not really sure it's discussed, is just kind of give them a longer grace period and say, you got to figure this out. Either apply for immigration to one or the other, or just stay where you are, or come back.
I mean, what it comes down to, though, and we really shouldn't dance around this, UKIP, which kind of drove the Brexit referendum, they're pretty racist. They don't like immigrants because they're bringing in crimes. And I believe one of them was quoted as saying that it wasn't safe to walk through certain parts of Manchester now because there were so many refugees, which was obviously ridiculous. But it's kind of the sentiment that was driving at least part of the Brexit referendum. And if you allow for these reciprocal visas, and if you allow Britons to stay in Europe and Europeans to stay in Britain, well, a lot of Europeans now are refugees from the Middle East or Africa. They have EU citizenships in a lot of places, namely Germany and Spain are the big grantors of it. So the question is, does the UK get to decide which EU citizens come in? And I don't have an answer for that. I'm just saying there's really no good solution for Britain because Britain wants to have its cake and eat it too.
Yeah, and let's not forget that this the whole anti-immigration sentiment in Britain is a lot older than the refugee crisis is. I find British anti-immigration sentiment kind of funny because, as far as I know, it's the only place in the world where there's still race baiting against Poles, which is kind of an amusing thing for me.
If it wasn't, horrible racism.
Well, yeah, but it just seems out of place. Anyway, so Yeah, I think you're right that there's all sorts of outrage about the British not being able to come to the EU visa free, but there are the same demands that they don't want people to let in there. And I think that gets to the core of the problem with Brexit, that the main people behind it don't really know what they want.
Yeah, or they know what they want, but they're conflicting things. I think both are probably true to a certain extent. And I mean, we have to consider also that we do kind of know what Theresa May wanted, and it was for Great Britain to stay in the European Union. She was a Remain campaigner, but is now, as the MP of, or as the PM of the Conservative Party, obviously a hardline leaver, because she's listening to the will of the people. So take that as you will. It just seems a little hypocritical, I guess, for her to be leading this effort.
Well, it's hypocritical, but you also have to admire her for doing her job, even if she personally disagrees with it.
She has been very good at holding an opinion that she does not personally hold and sticking to her guns. I'll give her that. What she's not been particularly effective at is drafting a deal that literally anyone will agree to. So we've talked a little bit about the minor issues and how that even in those minor problems, it's really hard to find fixes, and there are only 2 months left. Then let's get to the sort of broad stroke fixes. We've talked already a little bit about the idea that there could be a second referendum. A couple of months ago, the EU's highest court said that would be fine, that just because they've triggered officially the vote to leave, they are still members, and that if they retract that vote to leave, they're allowed to stay consequence-free.
And this is due to EU, basically the way that EU treaties are set.
Right. So that's an option. There are other options, including a no-deal leave. And there are still other options, including an extension, a unanimous vote within the EU to extend the negotiating time period. Which of those do you all feel is most likely to occur? Especially William, I'm interested in hearing if you heard whisperings in France of whether or not the French and Spanish governments, who are some of the heaviest hitters in the EU, bar Germany, would be willing to extend the timeline in the interest of protecting their economies.
So in a certain way, I can speak a little bit more heavily with France because that's where I was. The French government has displayed a certain degree of interest. They acknowledge the fact that France and Britain are close trading partners, being so physically close to each other, and also linked via the Channel Tunnel, which does take a high degree of trade as well as maritime trade.
For all of you who know it as the Channel, that would be better.
Yes, the Channel. Now, that being said, the French population is kind of reveling in just the discomfort of their Anglo cousins across the channel. They just find it hilarious that, like, Britain is just screwing this up so bad. A lot of what I got the consensus was, especially in France, was the union is doing admirably. You know, the union has said, we're willing to negotiate. They set a timetable. They did it. Britain's the one dropping the ball. And Britain is the one screwing up this process. So the impression that I was getting was, especially in France, and I don't know how the French government would vote, because again, I said the French government is more interested in extending the deadline. With a lot of the French people, they're just like, if they leave, they leave. And there's not really a desire to extend this deadline.
Yeah, I think the same thing is probably true for Spain. Obviously, they do appreciate having trade ties with England, but there are particular domestic political concerns. Pedro Sanchez has become Prime Minister of Spain because the ruling party lost a no-confidence vote, partially for domestic reasons. There were corruption scandals, but partially also because they haven't been negotiating quite as well as they would have liked in the Brexit negotiations. I don't think Spain would be willing to extend the deadline for the Brexit negotiations, especially because, as we've mentioned, Theresa May hasn't been putting in a real great good faith effort. Now, whether that's because she hasn't been willing to or because of the competing political concerns in Great Britain, I don't think we can speak to that. But for whatever reason, the negotiations haven't gone well, and there's no evidence that they would go better with an extra 3 months, an extra 6 months, what have you.
Yeah, and that seems to be the really big issue here, is that Theresa May, I don't think, can provide a better deal. that the EU is willing to also to agree to. The mathematics of the votes in Parliament just suck for her. They suck so bad. So she's trying to appeal to just enough people to get it to win, and just can't.
There's no winning coalition anymore.
So if the French and the Spanish see this as an internal British issue that they've negotiated in good faith and that their deal has been struck down, what about the internal British solution? The idea that they could propose, initiate, and pass another referendum. I understand that 2 months is a tight timeline to make that turn around, but suppose, for the sake of argument, that they could pull it off. That maybe the EU gives them an extension and they hold the referendum, whatever.
That is an interesting thing. I think the EU, and Spain particularly, probably would be willing to give them an extension to hold a second referendum.
So let's say that the circumstances are such that there is a timeline wherein a referendum is feasible. How likely is it that they put a referendum forward? There have been allegations, especially in the news recently, but as early as the referendum itself, that foreign governments may have meddled in the results of the referendum, if not directly by tampering perhaps with polling machines or what have you, then actively by pushing social media campaigns. I'm thinking about Russian and potentially even Chinese interference, by putting forward stuff like Facebook videos and Facebook posts that were either racist or race baiting, or just economically inaccurate that may have pushed the results. It was a very, very close vote, as we've mentioned, a 0.5% difference between Leave and Remain. So do you think that with all of those questions about the legitimacy of the earlier referendum, would it be likely that MPs would initiate a second one? Or is the other voice stronger, that voice that says the people have already been asked, they have answered, why ask them again? Which one is going to win out here?
So here's an interesting thing that I just want to bring up. So technically speaking, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the referendum that was originally used to leave the European Union was a non-binding referendum. This meant that it had no legal stance, that it can't be used as law. So what caused Britain to leave the European Union was an act of Parliament, meaning Parliament voted, yay, we're going to do this and we're going to do it at this time. What this has meant is that for the Great Britain, they can choose not to leave by an act of Parliament. It doesn't actually have to be a second referendum. It probably would be, given how much the referendum has been played up as the will of the people, and like this thing is, a legally binding thing. So they're probably going to do another referendum to send it back. But theoretically, if the British government is willing, the current British ruling government is willing to take a sucker punch to the gut, they could theoretically just be done with it and probably let their rivals win the next election, but also avert this entire thing.
I mean, really, the Conservatives have to pick their poison at this point. Do they want to die because they're taking a hard Brexit, and that's very unpopular? Do they want to be sapped away by EU negotiations that ultimately put forward a deal that's not favorable to them? Or do they want to just take the cyanide pill and call a second referendum? I do think when you mention the Russian interference, though, it gets to really shaky ground when you ask about invalidating the results of a vote based on interference from such and such party or on alleged interference from a foreign government, because then the question becomes, what vote can't you then allege has been interfered with, has been invalidated by anything, any sort of untoward behavior. But it's not, at the end of the day, William's right, it's not a legally binding vote. I think this is kind of flippant, but the Conservatives really just need to stand up and be adults about this, and deal really honestly with the situation they put themselves in.
And before Joe launches into Russia, because I get the impression he's biting at the tip, what's important to remember is the way that this interference is. It's usually portrayed as like, when you think of interference in the election, it's like election rigging, But that's not what the Russians are doing in the U.S. or in the United Kingdom.
No, only Michael Cohen was doing that.
Yes,
apparently.
well, that's... yes. But it's more like, the placing of advertisements isn't objectively illegal, at least in the United States. I imagine in the UK their laws are different. So I'm not going to just say one way about that or the other. But there's a case for saying, well, yeah, sure, the people might have seen these things, but at the end of the day, no one made them cast their ballot this way. They chose to do it based upon the information they had available.
Yeah, and I think that that gets to the way in which an election kind of fails, the principle of election fails at capturing, quote unquote, the will of the people, as is being said. So, like, if you have a massive advertising campaign saying we send £350 million a year to the EU, let's spend it on the NHS instead, and that is a total lie. And not only do they not send that amount of money, but it would not be sent to the NHS afterwards. If that's just total bull, they advertise it anyway. And people vote for Brexit based on that false claim, and it passes. Is it really possible to say that the election results mirror the will of the people, quote unquote? Now we're getting into the philosophy of how democracy is determined. But I guess that's just the way that I personally justify not being particularly against the idea of a second referendum, even though on paper it is rather undemocratic. I agree with Jacob that the way to avoid the most material damage to the country and to the world order at this point would be for people in Parliament to bite the bullet and revoke Article 50, but I don't think that's very likely to happen, and at this point I think a second referendum is the only way to avoid Brexit.
Yeah, so it's the question of, like, the legal requirement for canceling Brexit, which is just an act of Parliament, versus the political requirement, which is we have to have a reason to do this. We've built up the referendum as the will of the people. Britain needs a push. They're stuck in their negotiations with the EU. They're stuck in their negotiations in Parliament. They need something to jumpstart the process. And if they don't, I mean, we've mentioned it, but there is the option of hard Brexit, which isn't going to be good for Great Britain. It's not going to be particularly good for the EU, but it won't be catastrophic for them. The EU is willing to play with the idea of a hard Brexit, where the UK really can't afford to.
So let's go to that sort of post-apocalyptic world. The Conservatives have decided not to be adults. They don't hold another election, so the Tories can't decide to be... Sorry, not the Tories. The Labour can't decide to be adults. The EU has decided that they are going to be adults, and they're not going to let the timeline get extended. And the whole thing just sort of... We reach the passive option, and there's a hard Brexit. One day, everybody goes to bed on the 29th of March this year, and they wake up on the 30th, and they are no longer in an EU nation. All of a sudden, all sorts of automatic tariffs are in place. There are thousands of tons of goods left basically dry in ports as people try to figure out whether or not they could unload them. The Irish begin punching and screaming.
Just immediately. It's just the entire country erupts.
Automatically. What have countries been doing to prepare for this? Is there an ongoing understanding that this might be the reality?
Yes. Yes is the answer, and I can tell you, the French government just enacted its plan for the hard Brexit, which basically is providing material aid to businesses and working to establish checkpoint securities on all ports with British citizens that are coming into and out of France.
So France has apparently made their decision on where they think this whole thing is going.
France is just like, Britain's stupid. We're gonna lock this baby down, and they've established their no-deal plan. So France is fully expecting this to go no-deal, and it looks like other countries are starting to follow suit.
And I think what's evident from, I believe it was a white paper that was leaked from the British government just this past week, what's become evident is that the one country that most needs to prepare for a no-deal Brexit has not been prepared for it. It was a white paper leaked from Westminster that basically said they were just now starting the preparations to enforce a hard Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, and that they were expecting, first of all, just a backup at the Channel Tunnel, which is the only land connection between...
Again, channel.
The channel. They were expecting miles-long backups. They were
If we're going to keep calling it the cutesy name of Brexit, I think that the channel deserves its due.
Fair enough. Miles-long backups at the channel. And I think this was the key interesting point. They were expecting to have to deploy additional law enforcement to Northern Ireland. to maintain what would become an international border with customs checkpoints and visa requirements.
Which our listeners may be reminded in certain instances is simply marked by a road or some farmer's field. There's no real checkpoints in place on that border.
And that's what's going to make that Irish border so difficult, because back when, both of those countries agreed to no barriers and they both entered the European Union, there were a few major roads in between the two territories that were, checkpointed and things of that nature. Now there's hundreds. It's a almost impossible border to patrol now unless you're willing to deploy literally thousands upon thousands of personnel.
It's almost like it looks like it's one country at this point.
Yeah, it's almost like it's one people. Hashtag Free Ireland.
But joking aside, how about the private sector? How are they sort of battening down the hatches for this?
Well, they're leaving, right?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. private sector is skedaddling out of there, and Britain's already feeling the effects. And I think the expectation, and I can't remember, I think it was an 11% decrease in the GDP of the United Kingdom as a result of Brexit. Like once hard Brexit truly kicks in, and that's just such a huge amount. Like that's in a level of economic disruption I don't really caused by a singular event. I don't really think since the invasion of Poland or something. It's just Christ, that's a huge amount of economic disruption.
And a lot of it is that London is an international finance center, a very important one, both for the European Union and beyond its borders. And if we hit a hard Brexit, it's over. I believe already some brokerage firms are moving to Dublin, because Dublin it's a growing city. It has a lot of international headquarters now. Amazon is headquartered there. Technically, they have a headquarter there. But we're looking at an exodus of Great Britain's main remaining competitive industry, if we're being honest, which is money counting, bean counting. So yeah, it's not going to be good. It's going to be very, very bad.
I mean, Great Britain is very rapidly sliding at this rate from a second-rate economic power to a third-rate economic power, which is kind of sad given the fact that they used to be the first-rate. And so...
And to my left, of course, Blake is grinning widely because the two countries that benefit most from this are the two countries that are his favorites. Would you like to elaborate on those two countries, Blake?
So... my only take on a hard Brexit is essentially that Germany has long had a sort of tenuous grip on the most forceful, I'm not going to say powerful, because there are enough members of the EU that Germany can't unilaterally make things happen, which they've had to face a hard reality on, especially on immigration.
Generally speaking, in EU politics, they've needed to ally with France in some capacity in order to truly dominate.
And a lot of that was because UK was sort of a weird outlier in a lot of the EU votes, especially when it came to immigration. And
they were always the contrarian.
Yeah, and they could throw their weight around a lot. And that's not to say that even once the UK leaves, Germany won't have to fight Poland and Hungary and a whole bunch of other countries on a whole bunch of legislation. But once they no longer have to deal with the massive voting bloc that is the UK, Germany is going to have a de facto larger piece of the pie. And they're still going to have to work with France. I'm not saying that they get to abandon that, but France has been rather compliant on a lot of issues, and Germany, to its credit, has been rather compliant with a lot of France's requests.
It's a good working relationship between the two countries.
I mean, and not to get into too much of the theoretical realm, but a lot of the other things we've been talking about are a possible Polish exit, Hungarian exit, Greek exit. They're the kind of less Western-style democracy, less economically stable countries. I think Germany is going to be able to get its way more often. They're going to be able to levy real sanctions on Poland once the UK is gone, real sanctions on Hungary, and they're going to be able to do what they want to a greater extent with Greece, which may not be a good thing. I think Germany does need to be balanced.
Well, we can all disagree on or agree on that point. But the other country that Joe was referencing is Ireland. And per the Good Friday agreements that we mentioned earlier, the Northern Irish are allowed to, if 51% of the Northern Irish population at any point says we want to hold a referendum to rejoin the Republic of Ireland, the UK has absolutely no way of saying no to that. And if there's a hard Brexit, there is decent polling data that 51% of the Northern Irish would say, maybe it's time. And if I'm honest, for totally non-rational and completely personal reasons, that would be beautiful to watch.
Well, at the very least, the maps would be nicer.
Yeah. But all of that aside, and recognizing how long we've been rambling for, I think that I'd like to pose our sort of last question to everybody here, which is, what happens to all of the people? I'm basically saying, if you were a citizen of Great Britain who long ago decided that they were going to retire to name a countryside, the Italian coast, the French coast, the Spanish coast, yeah, the Portuguese coast, and ignoring the Portuguese recent decision.
Why ignoring that? Portugal's falling like such a hardcore stunt for such a little country.
But keeping in mind, just you're a UK citizen, or if you prefer, you're an EU citizen in Britain. What the hell is going on in your life? But before we get to the answer of that question, a quick reminder to our listeners that every opinion expressed on this podcast is simply the opinion of those who expressed it, and not at all associated with the official opinion of the college or anything like that.
I don't know. I think Blake represents the Irish Independence Front or something like that.
Maybe.
Is Blake receiving payments from Sinn Féin? Tune in next time.
If Sinn Féin is out there and want to sponsor me for an internship, I'm down. But also, if you enjoyed this podcast, or you enjoy listening to podcasts at all, please go ahead and take a listen to some of the other podcasts that the Podcasting Network at William & Mary sponsors. You can find them by simply going to any place that you listen to podcasts and typing in Podcasting Network at W&M. Now, panel, how do you react to this as a person suddenly isolated? We'll start to my left.
We've been really flippant. We've been taking part in a little bit of schadenfreude over this thing, as we should. But there is going to be a really real human effect. I think the world has been shrinking for the United Kingdom since the 1940s.
Yeah, I was about to say a long time.
For a long time, but this is going to be kind of an abrupt closing of the world. If you're a young person in the United Kingdom, it's likely that you were born into the European Union. You were born into an international community, and that's going to end. And I think it's going to mean a lot of opportunities are closing, and there's going to be a lot of wasted potential. And I think at the kind of basic level, that's the biggest tragedy of Brexit.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jakob on that. And tacking on as well, for many young people in the United Kingdom, their opportunities of domestic employment are about to become markedly reduced, given the reduction in trade that will inevitably occur due to Brexit. Britain is trying to offset this with new trade agreements struck with different countries, but it's really never going to be as good as just the European Union, which is quite literally on your doorstep. And despite this, Britain is still going to be affected by EU decisions. Whatever decisions they make on the common market and things of that nature will affect the value of British goods traveling into the European Union. They now just have literally no control over those decisions, which for Britain, if you think that, may be better or worse. But who knows? Maybe Britain will emerge victorious, stronger than ever from this. I think it's highly unlikely, but anything is possible. Maybe, we'll see a reunification of Ireland, and Scotland splits off into the one country it's always wanted to be, not part of the United Kingdom. Walesland rises from the ashes, who knows? But it's quite a unknown fog for the United Kingdom, but it doesn't look great.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said. If you're if you're a young person in Britain today, it's time to get out of Britain, whether that be by removing yourself or removing the country that you live in via referendum. It's what you got to do to protect your future. I agree with William there. Sure, maybe space aliens will come down and give Britain some vibranium because they hate French people or whatever. But odds are very good. Britain is about to become a very unfriendly place for ambitious and hardworking people compared to what it used to be, unfortunately.
Well, on that somber note, thank you all for listening. Stay safe and have a good day.